Hey students, this is Mr. Moore and I'm here with you on week 12. This is a class lecture for my government students. This is a class that's required for all 12th grade students. And even though 12th grade students have to take this class every year, it's not every year that we have a presidential election. So I hope that this is really relevant, and I hope that if you have questions about this, you bring it into class so we can discuss it. I'm recording this in 2020, and there is a presidential election like a week away. And so we're going to talk today specifically about the electoral process, what it means to run an election. And every 4 years, we have a presidential election. But in between those 4 years, we often have other elections, like members of Congress in the House of Representatives have to run for election every 2 years. So there's a different cycle. Elections don't happen like every year, but with local elections, state, governors and state assemblies, and with the U.S. House of Representatives for Congress, there's all kinds of voting. So it's not just a quick, simple, hey, check this president or this box here for that president. In a presidential election, there are all kinds of things that happen in an election process. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. How does voting and elections really work in the United States? We're going to start with a key election vocab, and probably the most obvious thing that we need to talk about are campaigns. When somebody wants to run for an elected office, like president, like mayor, like governor, like county sheriff, even if you want to get into the U.S. Senate or the U.S. House of Representatives, generally, if you want to run for an elected office, you have to create a campaign. And that is, you have to register. If you're going to officially register for running for a specific office, there are sometimes qualifications. For instance, if you want to run for president, the U.S. Constitution outlines how old you have to be and the fact that you have to be born a U.S. citizen and live in our country for a designated amount of time. If you want to run for the U.S. Senate, again, there's a certain age requirement and how long you've lived in our country. And again, with the U.S. House of Representatives. So whatever political office you want to run for, even if it's like the local school board or the local water board, if you want to run for a county office, the board of directors, you have to make sure that you meet the qualifications, and you have to fill out the paperwork by the due dates in order to register to run for an office. And so that's always the first step if you're going to have a campaign and you're going to seek an elected office. And then generally, if it's a really important position you're running for, or you really want to be organized, you might put together a staff. And, like if you're going to run for president, you might have a giant staff, and you might even have, groups in every single state that are kind of helping you run your campaign in a particular state. If you're just running for a local office, it might just be some supporters and people that you know to help you organize and get your message out. One of the most important things that campaigns do is raise money. And the reason you need a lot of money is because you need to advertise your idea. It doesn't actually take very much money to run for an office, like officially. So all the money is spent really on getting your message out, getting advertisement space on TV, or even putting things on YouTube, or setting up websites and having them run. So there's all kinds of rules about where you get your money from, how much people can donate, how much you can use in particular ways. And it gets really complicated, and we're not going to go over all of those complexities, but that's a big issue. How is the money being used? And if it's not being used properly, people who are candidates and are using this donated money, they can get themselves in trouble if they're not using it properly. And that's been a big deal. And campaign reform has been a big issue in the last few years about how much money is being given and how it's being given and how it's used. But that really is what it's all about: running advertisement, trying to get your message out. You can also plan huge events. If you're running for a local office, you probably won't plan huge events. You might just need to get some money to put some signs out on the road, maybe run some radio ads, maybe get on the local TV network, that kind of stuff. But if you're running for like president or a seat in the Senate, you might want to actually plan events and promote your agenda is something that everybody has to do. You kind of create an image and you want to personify that image out there to the public and have rallies, distribute paraphernalia. I drive down Bear Valley Road and I can see some people out there with giant signs and hats and T-shirts and flags for a particular U.S. Presidential candidate, and people will put signs up in their yards. And so all that paraphernalia costs money. Sometimes people will sell it as a way to fundraise. Some people just sell it as a business, because they know that people want to buy this stuff. But you need to set up a media presence, whether that's on social media or with news broadcast, actually get your name out there. And if you can get name recognition and you can get your face out there and seen, then you have a more likelihood of being voted into the office you're running for. So campaigns are huge and complex and they cost lots of money. Officially, you don't have to have tons of money to become president. That's not like in the Constitution, but everybody knows that if you can't raise money and you can't get that image out there, then you'll never become president. Now, when we're running big events like a presidential election, we'll sometimes have a pre-election it's not an official one, and it's just held within political parties. But they do have these primary elections where voting takes place before a general election to narrow the candidates within a party. Like in California, if you are registered with the Republican Party, then you can vote in the Republican primaries. If you are not registered as a Democrat, though, like sometimes they change the rules, but like this year, they allowed people who weren't Democrat to vote in the Democrat primaries if you registered with their group. You didn't have to register as a Democrat, but you had to ask for that primary voter, ballot. So it's kind of interesting. Every state kind of does it a different way, and each party kind of controls. If the Republican Party doesn't want non-Republicans voting in their, primary elections. So if you don't register for a specific political party, then you might be left out of the primary election process. So just a heads up on that. And of course, it happens before because you might have, like, say, I don't even remember the number of Democrats that ran in the primary, portion of the election process, campaign process during this 2020. But it was somewhere around 20 people, who'd thrown their name into the ring, and then it was slowly being weeded out by who could raise more money and, who was getting the press and whose name seemed to be spoken by other people. And of course, in the 2020 election, it kind of whittled its way down to Joe Biden, right? And then he got to pick a running mate to run as his vice president. And it happens to be one of the senators from California, right? Kamala Harris. So that's really important. Primary elections. They're not required, but it does help narrow the field down so there's not so many people on the ballot. And it's something that's become a part of the election culture in modern times. There's another kind of a way to do that. Instead of having primary elections, you could hold a caucus, which is really a group of like-minded people to make nominations. And Iowa is one of the most famous places for their Iowa caucus. They get these like kind of town meetings together. People have a chance to express their point of views and make some decisions on who's going to go on the ballot. What's interesting, if I look at my ballot here in California, even the options for who's on the presidential, on the presidential spot is not the same in every state. Now, the big ones like Trump and Pence, of course, and Biden and Harris are going to be on every state. But there are some third-party candidates that show up on the California ballot. And if I talk to my brother who lives in a different state like Colorado or Utah, or I have some family who lives in Idaho and other places, there are different options. I even have a brother who lives in Ohio. and he had a different option to vote, who could be president on his, and I don't have that on my ballot here in California. But I do have a spot where I could write in a name. So if I really wanted to vote for somebody I didn't see on the list, I could. Um, but I think that's really interesting. And of course, there is such a thing as absentee voting, which means, like, say my brother who was serving over in Germany with the Air Force, and he wanted to vote in a US election because he's a US citizen. He just happens to be living in Germany right now. He could get the voter ballot sent to him and still vote. And like my daughter right now is living in Canada. So if she wants to vote, if she's technically a citizen of the United States and she's technically a citizen of or resident of California, she just happens to be living in Canada, she could still vote in the elections right now. And of course, there's lots of mail-in ballots going on, especially with coronavirus. But also sometimes people just have a hard time getting into the polling stations on voting day. And so they like to be able to get the ballot ahead of time. And of course, the state of California and the county of San Bernardino sends registered voters a whole bunch of information, official information, in the mail. And there's a bunch of junk mail that comes from campaigns as well, where they're trying to promote their ideas. And again, that costs money to send out all those flyers and things like that. Okay, so those are just some key vocabs when it comes down to it. Obviously, there are two main political parties. There is, on the left, there's the Democrats, and on the right, there's the Republicans. On the left, we refer to any political party on the left as liberal, and we spent a bunch of time talking about what liberal means last week in our notes. And of course, on the right side, we refer to that as conservatives, and we talked about what it means to be conservative. There are other political parties that pop up over time, like the Green Party is actually quite well known and has had some, significant numbers when it comes to voting, but they've never put like a president in office or anything like that. There's also the Libertarian Party and the Constitution Party. For a while, there was even the Tea Party back just a few years ago, where people are trying to get back to the roots of our country. And by Tea Party, I mean thinking about like the Boston Tea Party, right? And the revolutionary ideas, Declaration of Independence, kind of going back to, what our country was founded on. So there is more than just Democrats and Republicans. And there are some seats in Congress that are held by independents. They were not a part of the Democrat or Republican, political establishment. So you can get voted in, and especially in local elections. So it's important to remember that political parties are not a necessary part of the political system, but they tend to be. They've kind of become a huge part of the culture and the idea of what people understand when it comes to elections. How do you get elected? To be honest, if you want to get elected to a major elected office, you really do need to be a part of one of the major political parties because they have the power and they get the money. And if you're not a part of one of those, it's difficult. A couple years back, I remember when I was younger, there was a third-party candidate named Ross Perot who was not in the Democrat or Republican Party. He knew that he wasn't going to get that vote or make those people happy, and he happened to be a billionaire, right? He was an extremely successful businessman, and so he used a lot of his own money to fund his own campaign, and he actually was really successful. He didn't get voted in as president. But he really made a huge mark on the political landscape, showing that an outsider could become president maybe one day. And in fact, even Donald Trump has kind of tagged himself as a political outsider, of course, saying, I'm not a politician, I'm a businessman. I just think that I could be a great leader in the country is kind of his message that he's sending. So he's definitely an outsider. He didn't go up in the ranks of the Republican Party, or he didn't go up in the ranks of the Democratic Party. He kind of came in from nowhere. And so some people, kind of think he's a wild card. And, some people in the political establishment don't like that. Okay. So just to remind you about caucuses versus primary. You can see this chart right here talks about the voting processes. Like when it comes to primary elections, voters cast secret ballots for the candidate of their choosing, and who can vote. It kind of varies from state to state. Like in California, the Republican Party might say, as they have, if you're not officially registered with the Republican Party, then you can't vote in the Republican primaries. And a lot of people are like, duh, that makes sense. But like last time, the Democrat Party didn't say that. They said, as long as you ask for permission, you don't have to be a registered Democrat to vote in the primary process. Okay. And of course, they're just trying to weed down all the candidates, so they just have one name to put on a ballot from a major political party. So again, primaries they are necessary, kind of, but they're not like officially a part of the general election process. And again, there are caucuses where participants break into groups according to candidates they support, the number of supports, of course. And there's different states, states that do caucuses, like Iowa, like I said, was one of the most famous. And again, sometimes you have to be officially registered with the Democrat or Republican, or even with another political party, if you want to be a part of their caucus, that event. Okay, so there are different ways of doing it, and that's one of the unique things about the United States, is it's not the same in every state. Okay, how can I get involved in a campaign? You could if you wanted to. It's a little late for this election, obviously, but you can get involved in campaigns. So you're like, well, I don't even know Donald Trump. How could I get involved in his campaign? Or I wish I could help Joe Biden, but how would I get involved? Well, you could contact a local chapter of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, and you can ask, what can I do? And, the first year you might be, making phone calls, or, helping flyers to get mailed out. And the next year you get involved, you might be able to actually meet the candidate and participate in helping organize events. It all depends on you and how involved you want to get. But if you don't want to get involved, you don't have to either. I think that's one of the great things in our country. But your voice, your vote, either way, or even if you don't like either of the two main candidates, remember there are other party options. Here's a few more important election vocab. And of course, anytime I can use my name for a pun, I certainly will. But I've used the word ballots a lot. A ballot is the actual piece of paper where you actually fill in the bubble, picking your different choices. Like, here's who I want for president. Here's who I want for our congressional representative in the House of Representatives, for our district. Here's who I want for our senator. Here's what I want to choose on this proposition or measure, etc. So they'll actually, the county of San Bernardino that we live in, will send you actually a sample ballot ahead of time so you can see exactly what it's going to look like. Because most people will show up at a polling station. And so, in the state of California and the county of San Bernardino, they want you to see what's actually going to be on the ballot. And they send you a ton of official information with both sides, different people's point of views and perspectives. But sometimes in different states, it's actually electronically, where you have touch screens, some of them are old school, where you do it on paper and you fill it in with blue or black ink. But it has like a list of people that you get to choose from, or different ideas you get to pick from. And I'm going to go over and talk about propositions and measures. So for instance, in 2020, when we're doing voting, it's not just the president, like, hey, I got to pick who the president is and done. There's all kinds of other propositions that are put on the ballot. And a proposition is a law that was going to be put into effect by the state legislature, right? The legislative branch of the state that makes the laws in California. But some people didn't maybe like that law, and they got enough signatures to put it as a measure on a ballot or as a proposition. Measures, I know a lot of the measures are more local, like specific to the town of Apple Valley. So this is really interesting. The ballot that I'm filling out, okay, that I'm actually voting on, is going to be different from somebody who lives in Hesperia, even though they're right here in the high desert, or Victorville, or Adelanto, or Oak Hills, or even down the hill. Like, I might have some in-laws that live in LA, and they have different measures on their ballot. Now, there are statewide propositions, and then there are local measures. And so there's a lot more than just voting for president. And in reality, I think sometimes those propositions and measures are more important than even who is the president, because none of us probably are going to meet who's going to be president. And, the president does make some important decisions and represents our country to the world. But really, how much I pay for taxes on water, how much I pay for sales tax in Apple Valley, that's going to affect me, I think, more than who becomes president. So really reading up on those measures and propositions are huge. So if you ever hear like Prop 8, that was a couple years ago, where people got to vote on the constitutional changes in California. And that's not the Constitution of the United States. That's just for how we have our own constitution for just California that kind of governs how our state works. So there's this idea of direct democracy, and direct democracy is not very often used, where we actually get to make real decisions on laws. For the most part, in the United States, we vote for representatives to make the laws for us, representative democracy. In fact, in the United States, we're a republic, right? When you think about the Pledge of Allegiance, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, right? That's the whole concept. We live in a republic where we choose people to represent us, and then they make the laws. Legislators make the laws, right? But this is a way where we actually get to do direct democracy, when we get to vote on propositions and measures, actual laws. In a way, we're the ones who are actually getting to make the laws. Now, we don't actually sit down and write them, but we get to choose instead of our representatives choosing for us, which is interesting because that's normally what happens. We pick the people who sit on the state assembly. They're the ones who make the laws for California. And so we don't actually get to choose if it's going to become a law. We just get to choose who gets to make those laws. So that's interesting. Direct democracy versus representative democracy. Now, what is a precinct or a polling place? Remember, I just said this out loud. Where I live determines what's on the ballot. So if I live in LA, even though the presidential names aren't going to change so much, and who we're going to pick for Congress does, though, because if I live here in Apple Valley, I am in a certain congressional district. And so it's really significant. Where you live geographically determines where you vote, like physically where you go in to vote. And lots of times, like schools will open up on voting day, and you can go into the gym or whatever. Sometimes churches will open up. There'll be an official polling place, or maybe say like the public library. So if you actually want to vote, you have to find out where the closest polling station is. And you can Google that online. It's not that hard to figure out. But it also can determine what's going to be on the ballot, which I think is fascinating. Okay. We need to talk about the Electoral College. So I love it if you would highlight the word Electoral College, because this is how we vote for president. And it's according to what the rules of the Constitution. And there's a reason why our founders put it in. But some people disagree with why our founding fathers put the Electoral College process into place. Honestly, it's because they didn't quite trust regular people to make important decisions like who's president. They wanted to leave that in the hands of wiser people. I think it's essential that you know and you remember that a presidential candidate needs 270 electoral votes to become president. There's a total of 538 available. And if you do the math, if you take your calculator and you punch in 538 and you divide by 2, you come up with 269. So if you get half the votes, you can't be president. So you have to get just over half. And if you get 270, boom, you become the next U.S. president. Remember, Americans do not directly vote for president. So even though on my ballot, I'm marking who I want to be president, that vote is actually not counted as far as who becomes president. What that does, when I mark it on my ballot, it tells the electors in my state how they should vote. And lots of times they're not even legally required to vote the way the people choose. I know that sounds weird. And how do we determine how many votes we get per state? Well, every state gets at least 3, and I can explain why. What we do is every state gets the number of electoral votes as they have seats in Congress. So at this point in class, you got to know that Congress has 2 parts, right? Congress is the legislative branch of our government, okay? And Congress has one part called the Senate and one part called the House of Representatives, okay? And every state gets at least 2 senators, okay? And every state gets at least 1 in the House of Representatives. But actually, the number of seats in the House of Representatives is based on population, okay? So if you add those 2 numbers together, 100 and 435 seats in the House, that gives you 535. Where's the extra 3 seats? That comes from the District of Columbia. Remember, Washington, D.C. is not a state. That's where the White House is. That's where Congress building is. That's where the Supreme Court literally is. There's a lot of people that live in D.C., the District of Columbia, and they don't have senators, okay? So they still get voting rights as far as president goes. So that's the extra 3 when it comes to the electoral votes. So not to be confusing, but let's say the state of Montana has 2 in the Senate and 1 in the House of Representatives. That's their 3 votes. But it's not actually the senators and congressmen that vote. That's just the number of votes. So you can tell that California by far has the biggest population in the U.S., and thus we have the most votes when it comes for president. But when it comes to voting for the president, we get 55 votes. Now in California, it's a winner-take-all situation. So if one candidate gets, let's say 15 million people vote for one candidate and 14 million people vote for another candidate, whichever candidate got 15 million, they're going to get all 55 votes. And it's almost like those 14 million people who voted for the other candidate don't exist. Their votes don't go for anything. And some people really don't like that. Some people are questioning whether we should get rid of this electoral college situation. It's very controversial, so you can see kind of the spread of how this works, okay? Prior to Election Day, each state, all parties within a presidential candidate choose potential electors. So the Democrats have already selected who are going to be their 55 electors, and the Republicans have already picked who's going to be their 55 electors. So whichever candidate in California gets more votes, those 55 electors get to go vote. Okay? Each state has a certain number of electors based on its representation in Congress, if that makes sense. Okay? So when voters in each state cast a vote for the presidential candidate of their choice, they are actually voting to select their state's electors. That's what we're really doing. We're actually not voting for president. We're voting for which party gets to send their electors to vote, because it's only electoral college votes that are counted when it comes to voting for the president. Now, with other things, we actually do a count, like an actual count, a popular vote. I'm specifically just talking about the presidential election. Okay? And after Election Day, the electors meet to vote for president, and the electoral votes are tallied by Congress. So even after Election Day is done and we, proclaim who won, there's still some voting that actually has to happen. Most states have a winner-take-all system, and that's why there's been a couple instances, this is weird, where more people voted for a candidate, but the other candidate got more electoral college votes. So that might not make sense in your brain, but I just told you in California, we can have 15 million people vote for one candidate, and 14 million people vote for the other candidate, and all 55 votes are going to go just for the candidate that won more votes. So it's almost like 14 million people voted for the other guy. But that's a lot of people, right? And it's almost like their votes are thrown away. So there has been a couple instances where one person got more people to vote for them, but the other candidate won. What matters is 270 votes. Now, we've kind of talked through this. It's a nice visual aid that if you want to run for president, and there's other positions, I've talked about that extensively today in our notes, but the U.S. Constitution requires that you are born a citizen. You can't be from another country and become a citizen and run for president. So no immigrant could ever become president of the United States. Their kids could, because they could become a citizen, and then their kids would be citizens. But no immigrant could ever become president of the United States. You have to be at least 35 years old, and you have to live within the U.S. for 14 years. And those are the only three. There's the unofficial. You got to have money, you got to have a name, and you got to have people who will support you. But that's not official. That's just, the obvious duh. And then, of course, step one, we get into the primaries and the caucuses, and that's when you hear a lot of political campaigning and ideas going on and debates that are happening. And then you get the national conventions where the parties get together and select who's going to be their official representative. Okay. And then we get continued debates and messages and tons of mail that comes, because people are sending out their ideas to try to promote. You see signs on the roads as you drive around your community. And then we have the general election, which is like a week away from when I'm recording this. And then, of course, we have the Electoral College, and it's fascinating to see. And, of course, there's a couple of months after a president is elected. There's going to be a couple of months until the president is inaugurated in January. So even though in November we're going to know who the next president is, so there's going to be a little bit of window of time. Lots of times they call him a lame duck president because everybody knows they're out, and so they kind of don't respect what they say, even though they're trying to get stuff done before they leave office. It's also a time when presidents will do a lot of their pardoning, which is interesting, that they can forgive any person for any crime committed within the U.S. But there's going to be a short amount of time where we have a president-elect. Now, if it's the same dude, like if one president wins and then he wins again, then it's pretty obvious business as usual. But if there's going to be a transition of power, that's going to be significant and interesting, okay? This is a nice map where it kind of shows from the last several presidential elections. Obviously, we don't have the 2020 data right now. I'll have to update this for future years. But we got up to 2016. That was the last presidential election. The red states are the ones where Republicans won. Okay, in all four last presidential elections. The purple ones where they were Republicans were, at least twice in the last four elections. And the light blue states, where Democrats won the three of the four, and of course the dark blue carried by Democrats in all last four elections. So you can kind of see where the swing states are. That's what they call them, where sometimes they go Republican, sometimes they go Democrat. And Florida is always one of those swing states. If you want to know why Florida, well, you've got some really heavily populated, dense areas. And urban areas tend to be Democratic, right? The left, liberal. And also you get a wide mix of different ethnicities, and that also tends to be on the liberal side. But you also get the southern. It's like a southern state, which is very traditional. And you also get a ton of people that retire. And a lot of these retired people, are very active politically. And so you get a real mix in Florida. That's why it tends to be a swing vote. Why should you vote? Well, I feel like if you don't vote, then you don't have the right to complain about what happens. If all you are is a complainer, you need to get out there and vote. And if you don't vote, then I don't think you have the right to complain. Okay? So if you want to have a say in how this country turns out and who's going to lead us into the future, if you have opinions, if you don't have opinions, form some opinions. I think this map is really interesting. This is the last presidential election, kind of by county. And you can see where there is huge populations, you can see different, the lighter, the more red it is, the more Republican it is. The more blue it is, the more Democratic. And you get some of those shades in between. where you get a mix. It can go either way. And we here are in San Bernardino County, geographically the biggest county in the United States, like land size. You live in the biggest county, not population wise, but geographically. I think it's really fascinating. So that's my lecture. This is week 12, the election process or the electoral process. Thank you for being here. And these are the notes for week 12.